I'm Sarah No. I'm a program director at the Agility Lab and the module lead for Conservation by Design's Theory of Change module. I prepared this series of videos that are intended to help you facilitate or run your own Theory of Change module experience. And hopefully they can be a guide to you on how that whole experience gets put together. But before digging into the specifics of the module, I wanted to just pause and go over what a theory of change is, why it matters, the structure we use, and a little bit about the workshop itself. So first, about theories of change and why they matter. A theory of change is, at its core, a hypothesis or a model about how a desired change will happen. So as part of that, it articulates sort of what the team or project goal is, as well as sort of surfacing some of the logic or the causal pathways and early indicators along the way of how the team's interventions will lead to that goal. As part of that, it also surfaces where the hidden assumptions might be, and tries to center key parties throughout that model. We like to think about it as both a product and a process. So in terms of a product, it can be a really powerful communication tool, both internally for the team and potentially externally as well. That can really help explain at a high level what the team's why, what, and how are. In terms of a process, it is, the act of putting together a theory of change surfaces a lot of really important conversations and moments of alignment with a core working group. And so a team who has articulated a theory of change is a lot more likely to be aligned on what they're working on and why than a team who hasn't taken the time to articulate one. In terms of the conservation by design system, it is one of the two culminating modules in the conservation by design system. So a lot of these other module steps are meant to have preparatory conversations that support you in coming together to articulate your theory of change. And so, the theory of change module itself is it goes through 7 different elements in about 9 to 12 hours. And so there's not a lot of space for conversations like what strategies should we be prioritizing and pursuing. And so it's really helpful if the team ahead of time has a good sense of some of the basics of like, what are we trying to achieve? What strategies are we implementing? What does the key party or interested party landscape look like? So that they can go into the theory of change and have a supported and informed conversation. And then after the theory of change process, the theory of change in turn can become the backbone of your monitoring, evaluation, and learning or MEL plan. And also can support work planning and hub reporting and other things. And hopefully add a lot of value to the team as you are moving through implementation. So we'll talk about that as well. This is just a little summary of how the different conservation by design modules fit into different elements of the theory of change process. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this is here for you as a reference in case it's useful. So the theory of change format that we use with the conservation by design module is based on an evaluation that Craig Lesher did a couple of years ago, where he went through a series of many different papers on theories of change and sort of did an evaluation of what are the key elements that seem to come up a lot in different models and how do those elements work together. And he sort of came up with this format that we feel really confident about as a great starting point for any team. And the different elements are, as you'll see, there is sort of some context on here. So what are the problems that this project will actually address? Who are the people involved? And that includes both people who are or groups, institutions who are potentially bearing the impact of the problems and the solution, and also people who might be involved in helping us accomplish the work. The strategic approaches are the things that the team is doing, the interventions through which they hope to have change. Skipping over to the other side here, together the goal and the outcomes articulate where is the team trying to reach, what is the ultimate goal, and the goal statement is sort of that like visionary high-level summary, and the outcomes are sort of a way of making that goal really measurable. So what are the explicit measurable deliverables or outcomes that long-term outcomes that we're aiming towards over the time frame of the theory of change. In the middle here, the assumptions and intermediate results are sort of the meat of it. So the assumptions are the key risks or questions underpinning the logic of the theory of change. That means assuming we are doing the strategic approaches, what assumptions have to remain true in order for that work to result in the outcomes we expect. Intermediate results are early indicators that can help validate for the team that they are on the way to achieving the outcomes, but in a shorter time frame. This is an example output from the theory of change module. This is a recent team who went through the actual module. I've just removed sort of the identifying information since this was a pretty fresh draft that I think we're hoping to continue iterating on after the workshop. But think that it's a fantastic example. You can see it has all the key elements of the theory of change that we just talked about. The assumptions are visually represented, embedded in the logic of the theory of change, so you can see where those fit. As you sort of read through it, you can really see how those intermediate results lock into and relate to the key assumptions and will help the team validate that as they're moving through the work, they're on track towards their outcomes and their goal. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why theories of change matter. And I really love this quote, which is actually from a paper that Eddie Game, our very own Eddie Game of the Asia Pacific region, helped co-author in 2013. And there's a link to it here if you want to read more, but it says conservation is not rocket science. It is far more complex. Rocket flight obeys well understood laws, is predictable, and varies in only 4 dimensions. Thus, most rockets reach their targets, and when they do not, the reasons are likely to be obvious. Most conservation actions, in contrast, cannot be assured of reaching their target. And I think this is just a great way of explaining how important it is that in conservation we keep in mind that the work is not simple. Like we are trying to solve wicked problems, and theory of change, we believe, can be a huge ingredient to help us do that. So one way in which we think theories of change really help support teams is by helping teams state risk. And stating risk is the first step to reducing it. So one of the key elements in the theory of change are the assumptions, which do name sort of the key risks or gaps in the logic of the theory of change. So an example I wanted to share, a team that is doing watershed protection named an assumption in their theory of change that providing trainings to partners on how to implement water funds would be a sufficient level of support for them to be able to go implement those water funds on their own. And so when this team articulated the assumption, they actually also attached a measurable definition of success to it in the form of an intermediate result. And they actually found over time that they were able to invalidate that assumption. So providing trainers was not sufficient support. And this prompted them to really change their approach and invest in much deeper support and collaboration with implementing partners. And so it's really an amazing success story of a team, avoiding a potential failure scenario early by keeping an eye on a key risk and addressing it when they found that the evidence didn't support them continuing to rely on that assumption. Another reason why theories of change can be really powerful is that, you know, as we all know, what we measure matters, and we can really influence the focus of our work by picking the right success metrics to measure. So honing in on the intermediate results of the theory of change. These are early indicators that the team's efforts will translate into the desired outcomes. So I wanted to highlight an example from a peatland protection team who had a strategic approach in their theory of change to deploy viable economic alternatives to protect peatlands. In other words, this meant helping local communities have access to alternative sources of income besides, ag conversion, such as producing honey or carbon credits. And so during brainstorms for the intermediate results for this strategic approach, the team was generating a bunch of different IRs, including some like, how much money have we invested in honey infrastructure? Or how many communities have we trained on this new economic income alternative? And so actually they had a local community member sitting in the workshop, and this local community member pointed out that what would help them be more confident that the team's efforts were leading to actual, viable economic alternatives is connecting to a buyer or a market for the new product. And so this was just a great example, and huge kudos to this team for being really thoughtful about which voices were important to include in the workshop, for inviting these local community members, and for really like listening to those uh, those voices and incorporating that into the theory of change. And they were able to really adjust their intermediate result so that their focus was on identifying market and buyers early on in the process before doing things like building honey infrastructure or training community members. And so it's a really great example of how picking the right intermediate result, you can imagine like a really different sort of set of activities being prioritized by this team if they had, a different intermediate result. And so a great quote from Andrea Erickson, that the intermediate results process is what gives us the confidence to keep going and the discipline to keep asking, is this working? The final sort of why theory of change matter theme I wanted to touch on is just theories of change as a foundation for doing adaptive management. And when we think about, what adaptive management really is, I've sort of broken out different potential places for adaptive management into different levels of frequency. So the theory of change is at the very far end, the less frequent end where, maybe every 1 to 3 years, it is useful to have a conversation about reflecting on evidence and progress, and discussing potential adjustments to that theory of change. But then the theory of change can, even if we're not reflecting on that specifically as often, it can be the backbone for a much more frequent cadence of adaptive management as well. So like on an annual basis, maybe we're having strategy review conversations where we're pausing and saying, what progress towards our IRs have we made? What evidence are we seeing? And what adjustments might need to be made at that level. On a 3 to 6 month cadence, potentially like those annual goals, if those are broken down into even shorter term goals, like priority conversations with the team can be based around, again, the same sort of adaptive management conversations. And then even at the like work planning day-to-day, sort of what are we doing this week, next week type of conversations can like be broken down from the theory of change into like those more granular steps to support adaptive management at that really frequent level as well. And so that's really, you know, a way of saying that, we can if we're reflecting on evidence and completed work, using that evidence to align on decisions moving forward and integrating any potential adjustments into the plan. That can happen at all these different levels with theory of change as the backbone for all of that. A great quote by Tristan Schneider. I'm going to just read the end of it, but adaptability is crucial for ensuring that our large-scale conservation efforts achieve the sustainable and impactful outcomes we aim for. I really love that. Okay, just a few minutes talking about the module itself. So the workshop is structured in 3 parts that are meant to be about 3 to 4 hours each. As you can see, it can be run in person or virtually. But this is sort of like the suggested approach. Want to acknowledge that, different teams who have done different amounts of preparatory work or at different phases in their implementation cycle might need to customize or adjust this approach based on their own situation. But assuming this works for you, the basic format can be first taking some time to understand the context of the theory of change, aligning on what are the problems, who are the key parties, what are the goals and outcomes for a theory of change. The second session is focused on the logic of the theory of change. So what strategies or interventions are we including in our theory of change, and what assumptions are nested between that strategic approach and the ultimate outcomes that we're driving towards. And then finally, using that logic as the basis, drafting intermediate results that help us validate that that the logic of the theory of change is sound and that it's playing out as we expect. And so those 3 sessions are sort of the core of the module, and that's sort of those facilitated sessions with the whole participant group. But ahead of those workshop sessions, there's a planning phase that includes. We recommend that it includes plenty of time for the facilitator and team lead to sort of finalize the participants list and schedule the workshop. Often scheduling is the hardest part of this entire process with so many busy folks. But also, ample time for this core planning team to prepare for the workshop and make sure that they're integrating previous work as needed. And I'll go into that in a subsequent video in a lot more detail, like how you can integrate previous work that the team has already done. And then finally, there's sort of this optional element of the module where participants for the workshop or a larger input team that can't fully participate in the workshop but want their voices heard in the theory of change can fill out something we call the input worksheet as a way of sort of getting their opinions about what elements are important to include in the theory of change out on paper for the team lead and facilitator to integrate ahead of the workshop. And then finally, after the workshop, there's a bunch of recommended next steps, which again, we go into more detail in this in the facilitator guide and manual. But some key elements, strengthening the IR. So the theory of change workshop is the first time that teams are normally naming IRs if they're following the conservation by design process. And so often those need to be made more measurable or validated with social or subject matter experts or other sort of steps need to be taken. And there's more guidance on how to strengthen IRs coming at the end of this month, May 2024. But gathering and integrating feedback from key people, that's a huge element of this. Considering the intermediate results, the team can align on what the top priorities are for the next 3 to 6 months of work. And that's a really great conversation to have coming right out of a theory of change process. And finally, making a plan to come back together in 3 to 6 months to check in on your progress. That can be sort of the beginning of an adaptive management cycle using your theory of change as the foundation. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that, after the theory of change, hopefully the team is thinking and talking about how to create a monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan using the theory of change. And I'll just also mention that those last two bullet points around like work planning and thinking about priorities does tie in really well to thinking about mel planning, and those steps can kind of happen concurrently as well. And I also should just mention that, a lot of effort has been put into making the theory of change workshop and the mel workshop work together really well, so that there's a smooth, supportive transition for you as you're going to that phase. So workshop output. Something that I haven't talked a lot about yet is that the theory of change module is designed to help teams create a first draft of a theory of change. We often talk about it in terms of like a 60 to 70% first draft. And that is because the team's time together is really precious. And what we heard from teams before sort of designing this workshop is that often they were going through such a lengthy process to create a theory of change by the time they got through even creating the first draft, it was already out of date. And what we wanted to do was help teams sort of step back and really think very quickly in a short amount of time about the whole logic of how everything fits together. And then after the workshop, do any wordsmithing or adjustment, or making things more measurable, et cetera, after the fact. But coming out of the workshop, you should have something that pretty well supports you already to start thinking about implementation. Second workshop output, greater team alignment, or at the very least, an understanding of where key misalignments might be, and where continued conversation might be really helpful. And then finally, some drafted intermediate results that are tied to the key assumptions or key logic gaps in the theory of change. And those can form the basis, again, of the team's monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. And so a final quote for you, just from one of our early theory of change team customers, Jackie Specht. As someone who is relatively new to strategic planning, it was a highly useful crash course in how to develop a theory of change. The workshop really helped us come together as a team to develop a shared understanding of our program's goals. So thanks so much for that. And hopefully this was a helpful overview. That's all I have to say for now about why theories of change, what theories of change are and why they matter. And we'll get into a lot more specifics in subsequent videos about how to work through the module itself.